I want to mention that that David Andelman and Pamela Teitel, who endowed the prize, are in the audience. David put a note on the chat, which I will read to you. But David, if you're listening and you would like to come in on audio, raise your hand and we'll make that possible. David, who was a colleague of mine many years ago in the Balkans, when he was a correspondent for the New York Times. And he writes, "It has been such a privilege for Pamela and me to endow this marvelous prize. Bravo to these brave and extraordinarily gifted NPR journalists." So thank you. Thank you so much, David. This really should be a chance for you not only to get lots of praise and admiration, but also to get in whatever whatever points and messages you want. So I'm going to open the floor to you for any other points that we should have made and haven't.
I just want to make the point that I am just incredibly gratified and humbled that people will actually listen and care about, people in Mosul, about people a world away. It's just incredibly heartening. And I guess I'm always a tiny bit surprised at it, but it is a truly wonderful thing. And maybe the moral there is that, people love hearing stories about.
I don't know why I screwed it up. How did I screw it up? Shit.
You never do.
Now I'm gone.
And there we go. And we do have David Andelman on the line. I recognize that voice. So David, we can hear you.
Hang on.
David, we can hear you now. Well, we thought we could hear you. David, go ahead if you can hear me.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
I hear you.
Oh, excellent. Okay. So first of all, it's just such a privilege for Pamela and myself to have sponsored this award. Just to recognize your amazing work, Jane, and everybody else. But, it really, there wasn't much left after you listened to this extraordinary piece. There wasn't much left in questions to ask. But I would like to ask one interesting question. I've always been interested in context, especially in international journalism. I have a book coming out in January that talks a lot about that. And one of the things I discovered in this course of research was that apparently 12 centuries before Muhammad, the epicenter of the Assyrian Empire was in Nineveh on the banks of the Tigris outside what is today Mosul. And I'm just curious whether, it's been an extraordinary area for, back to 4000 or more BC, there was among the first human settlements were in that area. So I'm just wondering whether the people in that area are aware of their amazing history in the context and everything that they represented to the world, not only to their own location.
They are, that's part of the Iraqi sense of pride, I think. They realize that the streets they're walking on used to be the capital of a very powerful empire. It's sort of an abstract thing, I suppose, because if you look at Nineveh and Nimrud, the other Assyrian palace, most of that is in museums and not Iraqi museums so much. And it's in the British Museum and in the Pergamon in Berlin. People don't have a lot of access to their own history there, but it is still a very deep source of pride. And you can actually trace that incredible history from ancient Iraq to when Mosul was a cultural capital. It was Mosul and Aleppo. And Mosul was this incredibly city on the trade routes. So it was rich, it was a commercial city, it was full of crafts, and it's always had an incredible cultural life as well. So in many ways, it's really a very special city. And as you say, with an incredible ancient history, yes, people do, I think, keep it as a source of pride without sadly being able to have much access to the part of it that was there.
Has much of it been destroyed? Well, I guess much of Mosul was destroyed, of course. We can see that.
So yeah, ISIS destroyed one of the main sites that's near one of the walls of Nineveh. It also went into the museum where much of the pieces had been taken for safekeeping, but it still destroyed pieces in the museum. Right. It destroyed also the minaret that was a symbol of Mosul. It destroyed one of the mosques. A lot of destruction there.
So one final question: how are you going to? What's your next act going to be for the Times? How can you top this? I guess for the Times.
Oh, I think, what I'm really looking forward to is basically carrying on what I've been able to do at NPR, which is kind of dig into stories and dig into and get to know people and characters and find those people who are pretty much everywhere, who just tell that amazing bigger story of a country that has reinvented itself like several times over since the US invasion and since Saddam Hussein fell. So a lot of things I want to follow. The Yazidis, the Yazidi religious minority that ISIS embarked on genocide against. The ability to cover the aftermath of a genocide in our lifetimes is just extraordinary, and I think deeply important. Yeah, so many stories. Very excited.
Bravo, and keep up the great work. And we're
Thank you so
delighted
much.
we can
Thank
recognize this sort of thing.
Thank you both for this wonderful award. Thank you.
And David, I appreciate the word you use, context. I'm very interested that you're writing a book about that. I think that that's so much of what we talk about when we're thinking about episodes. There's another episode of ours called War Poems about Afghanistan, in which we learned that the Taliban is accessing an Afghan history of poetry going back going back, but using that very effectively to counter kind of modern American messaging. So understanding context is more than just the work of anthropologists. It can literally be about whether you win or lose a war. But I think too, the question of context is what I love about this story in particular is that so many of the stories we get from a place like Mosul are these snapshots, usually the snapshots of the worst moment in that city's history. And what was so exciting about working with Jane was that she had seen the long game over the ups and the downs, like a person, in fact, like a generation who had grown up that way. And so how does that shape that generation? Jane had really watched them grow up and watched the experiences that had shaped them. And so that was a way we could get inside people's heads and understand how they saw their world instead of just seeing it from the outside in a moment of war.
We've got a good question over the Q&A from Bill Holstein, an old colleague of mine from UPI many years ago, who then was a foreign correspondent, wrote for Business Week, and is now an author. And he asks, Mosul was known as sort of a melting pot in Iraq. It was partly Sunni, partly Shiite, partly Kurdish. How do those relationships work these days?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's pretty much all Sunni these days. That's one of the things about the sectarian war that followed toppling Saddam, in that places became partitioned. And we allude to that actually in the podcast. The perception that that the residents of Mosul who are Sunni didn't fight, that they welcomed in ISIS. And that was a reason why the Iraqi government took so long to start the Battle of Mosul. That was the reason why there were so many civilian casualties. One of the most extraordinary interviews I've done while at NPR was actually at a panel in the Iraqi city of Sulaymaniyah, and I was interviewing the former Iraqi prime minister who had approved the battle plan for Mosul, which caused so much destruction. And we had documented through more records, through the cemetery, we had documented several thousand civilian deaths. I referred to them and asked him if he had been prepared for those when he approved that battle plan. And he said, well, no, there were only 8 deaths. And I was stunned. And I said, 8? And he kept insisting only 8 civilians died in that entire city. A lot of residents of Mosul think that too is because it's a Shia-led government. But one of the things you realize when you talk to people in Mosul is they're not that sectarian. Sectarianism in Iraq, I think, has pretty much mostly always been driven by politics, by money, and by other countries. And it's waned among Iraqis in general.
Well, we are just about at the end of the hour. So let me close by, again, congratulating you, Jane, and the entire team from Rough Translation. Thank you all. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Sana. Thank you, Michael. Thanks to all of those in the credits who weren't with us today, but deserve to share in the joy and the recognition. For those of you who have not listened to the piece, please go listen to it right now. For those of you who don't already have Rough Translation on your list of regular podcasts, this piece drove me to Rough Translation, and it's now on my regular podcast list. So I commend it to all of you. And of course, thanks to David and Pamela for endowing the prize, and thanks to the Overseas Press Club and Patricia for making it possible. And let me hand us back to Patricia.
Well, thank you, Doyle, for moderating such a fascinating conversation. And I also have to note that Rough Translation also won another of the OPC awards this year. So that's a double winner this year. So congratulations.
Thank you.
And so that's it. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
All right, bye.
Thank you, everyone.